Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Freedom Forum, and my guest from Canada, Wallace Klinck. Welcome, Wallace.
Hi, honey. How are you doing? We're warming up just a wee bit.
What are you up to? You up to zero yet,
I
Wallace?
think yesterday it was around minus 18. I think maybe on Wednesday it'll be minus 4, but then it seems to be getting minus 10 and 12 in that area. It gets very slow to
I,
give us some relief. It's really hanging on.
I really can't imagine that. I mean, I'm a person of the bush in the desert, and in an environment where it can get up to say 47 for extended periods. But this minus 40, minus 20, it's just so foreign to me. It's
Yeah, don't pain yourself over it. It's not worth it.
That's excellent, excellent. All right. Well, our subject for today is actually titled the Alberta Experiment, and I want to touch on a little bit of history and the resources that we've got right here. And as we work through this issue, I think it's most important that we actually consider that by jingoes, you can do your own research. So first of all, I'm going to go to the Australian League of Rights Library, and the library is here, and this is actually in the library is the archives for the social creditor, the social credit, and there's another one there as well. Where is it? The social credit challenge, and I think there's another voice. There it is there. So these are all the principal journals around that time, and they're starting around 1934. And so this is the PDF beautifully scanned in by people who love the subject, who felt that the archives were most important for everyone to have. And then finally, over on the Veritas Books website is the book, The Alberta Experiment by C.H. Douglas. So that's the background in a sense of the scholarship that we've placed there to avail yourself of in regard to the Alberta experiment and the events that went on, the social credit movement events that went on in those early 1930s. Now, painting the picture that the Great Depression started in 1929, and it was a withdrawal of funds. It was a contraction of the money supply initiated by the major banks in Britain and America, and then it spread worldwide. And that contraction of the money supply was a forced people who had loans to repay their loans on the spot, and of course they couldn't, and so there was massive foreclosures, and it held that position until 1939, in which case credit was then again released to finance the Second World War. Now, these are tactical facts that actually were eventuated through history over that 10-year period. In the midst of that, was this province. Now, you've got federal, province, provincial, and then you've got local. And that's the political structure in Canada. And the province of Alberta, western coast of Canada, they were doing something different. And that's the story that we want to talk about today. So, Wallace, the floor is yours.
Oh, yes, Arnie. The social credit journal that you just pictured on the screen was actually the initial publication. Douglas split with some of the people. Some of his people split, and they set up the Social Credit Secretariat with the Social Creditor being their official journal.
Hmm.
So, but anyway, it's interesting that we have access to some of those historical documents. Social credit, of course, as you know, really started around the end of the First World War. And there was social credit consciousness in Canada prior to the 1930s. It was more of a sound intellectual movement that wasn't party, it wasn't political in that sense. But it was a group of people who had an appreciation of these things. And one of the major publishers in Canada actually uh, funded some of this activity. But in any case, as you know, we hit the Depression, and Abraham had been a very, very active fundamentalist radio evangelical, and he had actually developed a large following. And Aberhart was a math teacher. He was taught. He was from Ontario, but he taught at the college in Calgary, and anyway, he became extremely concerned about the really dire conditions, as you had referred to, due to the contraction of credit, because, well, farmers and their families were found sitting at the crossroads, having been dispossessed of their property, of their farms, really terrible situations. And then one of his students committed suicide because of
Mm.
the pressures of the Depression. Well, now today, people commit suicide right, left, and center, and nobody seems to take much notice of it. But in that particular case, Eberhard was really, really affected by this. It was a very personal thing and a very close tragedy, and he became very concerned about the plight of the people in general, and he read a book called The Meaning of Social Credit by Morris Colburn, who was a
Mm-hmm.
playwright, and he was very taken up with it, and he decided to start promoting social credit on his radio broadcasts, and he developed a considerable following in a province that actually was right next to Saskatchewan, which more is oriented towards socialism. Whereas, due to Eberhard's encounter with social credit and his publicizing of it, so Alberta took a very different course. And that is some of the earlier aspects of the situation. Eberhard, there was an election in 1934, and the social creditors literally decimated the United Farmers
Mm-hmm.
government, which I think had ideological connections with the movement in the United States, the agrarian movement there. There had been a conflict between the Western agricultural states and the financial powers in the East.
Mm-hmm.
Similar, and that was similarly paralleled in Canada. But there had been quite a history of it, and you've heard of William Jennings Bryan and his famous speech where he asked, "Are we going to allow humanity to be crucified on a cross of gold?"
Mm.
You see, the financiers had restricted credit, and they had come down on the farmers at the least opportune time when they couldn't afford it to repay their debts, and they were, possessing or repossessing property, and there was a lot of resentment in the West there at that time, and it was a very serious issue.
Mm-hmm.
And as a matter of fact, there was a conflict between the establishment of a Bank of America and more decentralized banking. And Andrew Jackson was very opposed to the Bank of America.
Mm-hmm.
And as a matter of fact, he said, "I killed the bank."
Mm.
However, in 1913, with the Federal Reserve, that was all undone. But
Yeah. Yeah.
in any case, so that there is sort of a connection there between Alberta, I think, and the financial reform activities in the United States, which are not well known. We're not really taught anything about those things, to my knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a real history,
Mm.
and
I just want to touch a little bit on this, Wallace, because I think that that's fine. You and I understand what we're talking about, but
mm-hmm.
I don't think our audience appreciates that while this, if you like, these goings on of the Great Depression, the vying for power and positions by the major banks in order to dominate societies, dominate countries, in fact, dominate whole trading blocks. And then in amongst it was this province of Alberta that decided to try something different. And it tried to actually undo the monopoly that the banks have, one of credit creation and also of redeeming debt. And those are my words, Wallace, because that's the perception that I get from the efforts that were attempted in Alberta. And I wonder if we can just get back to that in the sense of what was the mechanism that they were proposing and why would it have redeemed debt and balanced the financial system so that the people of Alberta were able to afford to buy what they actually produced.
Well, problem is that Eberhard did not run in the election. Eberhard actually there was a seat that was vacated for him after the election, and then he ran, and of course he assumed the leadership and the
Hmm.
premiership.
Hmm.
But the government dilly-dallied because Eberhard didn't really understand the situation in a highly technical manner.
Hmm.
He had a big heart, and he was very much anxious to do something to relieve the suffering of the people. But in any case, the situation dragged on, and there was an insurgency where some of the better members of the government, the people who are more disciplined and understanding of the subject, more or less gave Eberhard an ultimatum that he'd better get busy and do something.
Hmm.
Well, Douglas had sent two members of his organization over to Alberta to assist, and one was L. Dennis Byrne. He was a British insurance actuary, a very qualified man. And then there was another man as well who was sent. And so Eberhard, under tutelage from Dennis Byrne especially, did begin to understand the situation better. You see, the problem with social credit, as social credit reveals, is that there is a lack of purchasing power, which really means there's a lack of cost liquidation
Hmm.
in the
Hmm.
system.
Hmm.
Because if you don't have enough purchasing power, business can't recover its costs.
Hmm.
And today we try and overcome that by simply borrowing against the future, but that doesn't eliminate the costs. It merely transmits them or transfers them to the future.
Hmm.
And but Abraham didn't quite understand that, and he seemed to think that you would have to have some kind of issue dividends, but have some kind of a taxation mechanism to recover the money,
Hmm.
not realizing that the money is being prematurely canceled. There's a shortage of it. It's not that it has to be redistributed.
Hmm.
It's a totally different concept.
Hmm.
So Abraham didn't understand that at first, but toward the end of his life, I think he was really getting to understand it quite well.
Yeah.
And so you had this enormous um, social upheaval in Alberta where there was a new consciousness, a new desire to free humanity from the domination of finance.
Hmm.
And although it wasn't understood properly by a lot of people spiritually and psychologically, it was certainly given an enormous support, of course, with reliance being placed upon the leadership.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, it took Abraham died prematurely. He went out to BC. He had just delivered a powerful lecture attacking the international financial powers. And he died out in Vancouver when he was there. And that interrupted the situation
Hmm.
quite badly. And of course, Mr. Manning, who had joined him in his evangelical activities, was the next in line, and he took over the leadership. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out to be well, because under his leadership, he rejected Douglas. Actually, some of Douglas's books, to my knowledge, were actually incinerated. They left a little and genuine old man in charge of an office in Edmonton to sort of pacify people who wanted to know what was being done along the social credit means.
Hmm.
But he had to be very careful what he said.
Hmm.
And he was very upset about this business of Douglas's works being, literally sabotaged, because he knew himself what the score was.
Hmm.
There was also, as you know, the prosperity certificates were brought out, but that was a system of certificates where they could only be held for a certain length of time, or you would have to buy stamps in order to put on them. And that was done to force them to move rapidly to try and speed up spending.
Hmm.
Well, you see, that was the wrong approach. That comes after the ideas of Silvio Gesell, who was a monetary reformer in Europe. And he was, well, in a sense, he was a communist.
Hmm.
And so it was a completely different thing. The problem is not that money doesn't travel too fast. The problem is that there is not enough money, that money, in fact, is canceled too quickly already.
Hmm.
It's
Just to
canceled.
just to touch on that cancelled comment that you've made several times, Wallace,
Mm-hmm.
in the process of producing goods and then placing the goods on the market for sale and those goods being purchased,
Mm-hmm.
what you're alluding to is that in the purchase of those goods, the money is returned back to the manufacturer, and the only option the manufacturer has is to actually manage his debt. And so what he does is puts the money back in the bank to pay the debt, and of course then it's no longer available for the community to use. So prematurely cancelled is actually just paying your bills, paying your
Yes.
debts off, and so there's no opportunity for that money to, as this fella you're just alluding to, the speed of actually of purchasing is going to actually alleviate something when in actual fact it's not. The first
No.
thing I do as soon as I get paid is I look at the bills that are due and I process them. And those bills obviously have to work their way through, and they do. It goes through to the bank, paying the debt, and the money is cancelled. And that's the first priority at every business. It can't actually function unless it runs with the same type of discipline. So
And
to, sorry, go on.
unless you do that, your reputation will suffer and your business will suffer, and you probably won't stay in business too long.
That's right. That's right. So getting back to the people of Alberta, my take on what I've read again in the last day or so was that it was essentially a province. So okay, it's a state. We call it a state in Australia,
A
and
province.
you had several major cities, Edmonton and Calgary, of which there was about 80,000 in the mid 30s,
Hmm.
and so you had two major centres. And Aberhart is preaching essentially an evangelical broadcast on the radio. And
Hmm.
the social credit electorate was actually a consequence of people studying
Hmm.
and looking at the answer to this financial dilemma. And they actually had to do scholarship in order to even get their minds around this thing about credit creation, money manipulation, monopoly of banks, and the fact is that the most profound thing I see in the situation was that the administration was actually antagonistic towards the electorate in regard to this social credit, if you like, dispensation, this social credit opportunity to actually liquidate the costs as they are occurring. Wallace.
Well, initially, of course, Eberhard was certainly a very genuine person. He was very genuine. And it's only after his death and the leadership passing on to Ernest C. Manning. Ernest C. Manning did not originally have much education. I think, if I'm not mistaken, he had nothing more than a grade 8 education.
Hmm.
But he was very religious. And sometimes when you get a combination of a high level of religiosity and ignorance, it's not a good combination
Hmm.
because it can lead to some very, assertive and assuming attitudes without being well informed. And if you're not well informed, you're not endowed with the truth. And
Would
if
that
you're
would
not
that
in,
would that fall into dogma? What you're alluding to? That
yeah,
the thing,
exactly, dog.
it's dogma. It's a predetermined point of view, and you're not prepared to actually consider or entertain other points of view because you
No.
have this position that explains the rules of the universe quite simply, and it's not going to actually get into the core or actually expand your point of view by looking at it further to look at natural law or what works and things like that. Is that a correct summary, Wallace?
I think so because people look for certainty.
Yeah.
People want to be secure within themselves, within their
Hmm.
minds, their own psyches, if you want. And they will often latch upon things just to be secure without really honestly pursuing things from a scientific and truly objective standpoint. And Douglas did not start with any preconceptions when
Hmm.
he did his analysis of the price system at the
Onset.
aircraft works in
Hmm.
Farnborough. He just started from here and worked on to try and discover what was going on because they were having a problem of some kind with their accounts.
Hmm.
And he made his discovery by searching step by step.
Hmm.
And he didn't start by some dogmatic assumption.
Hmm. And the difference, I put it to you that it's actually the difference between the inductive method, the Baconian method of scientific analysis, and
Mm-hmm.
the deductive, and that is the deductive. You make a deduction and then you try and fit everything into that deduction. Similar to, if you like, what we're seeing with the climate science. They're not prepared to take into account any new phenomena or any new observations. It's a settled science, and therefore we're no longer going to discuss it. But getting away from my divergence, we'll come back to we come back to, and I'm mindful of the time. We're 20 minutes into this, Wallace, and I know
Mm,
we've got this huge opportunity to actually continue on with Alberta
hmm
and the history of the Alberta experiment. And I think it's to me it's an excellent subject of where a small community of less than 1 million people, through scholarship, through reading, through studying, through taking into account the actual phenomena that's going on, recognised that there was a power that was actually manipulating the whole situation. The power that was manipulating the Great Depression, 1929.
hmm
It was the money power. It was the central banks that were actually causing this, and governments yielded to it instead of actually initiating remedial action and response to it. They actually yield to it. And Australia was no different. Australia had a history, 1912, 1924, of the Commonwealth Bank, of where we were actually able to execute the First World War plus
hmm
significant infrastructure projects, come out of the war debt free by having our own bank, the People's Bank. And of course, when that was emasculated under a Labor government, and it's been continued to be emasculated under Conservative and Labor, both
hmm
since then. And so Australia is now to the point where it is so indebted it can't move. And of course, it's always looking
Right.
for foreign capital to keep its economy going. When in actual
hmm
fact, what these people at Alberta were looking at was they were looking at a new way of doing things, and in this new way, it was actually going to redeem debt and allow the full productive capacity of the community to be realised into the pockets, into the spending power of the community. And that was the power of it.
Society has a real credit. Real credit is ability to do things, to achieve things. But we operate under a financial system, and finance has to match that real
Hmm.
credit. So your real and financial credit have to be properly matched. There was yeah, social credit would make each individual area independent in the sense that it would be able to use the resources available to it within its own jurisdiction,
Hmm.
and that it would be able to conduct an economy in such a way as it can so as to consume the product of its own industry within its own borders.
Hmm.
There could be international trade, but it would be trade, this for that, not
Hmm.
trying to beggar your neighbor by sending him more real goods than you're taking back so you
Hmm.
can capture credits.
Mm.
So yes, it's financial independence. That's what it is. And of
Mm.
course, the present system with debt takes away the independence of the individual,
Hmm.
gradually erodes it more and more and more all the time. The
Mm.
more in debt you get, the more you are a slave, basically.
That's right.
So,
Yeah.
and anyway, the Douglas did a where did I put? Oh, here it is. He did an analysis that was published in the Social Creditor. Douglas analyzed the social credit in Alberta,
Hmm. Yep.
and he concluded basically that the Alberta government was little more than a state socialism.
Hmm.
What rescued Alberta was the discovery of oil in Leduc in the early 1940s.
Hmm.
That is what really rescued the province
Hmm.
because then they had an income from outside of their borders through exports
Hmm.
and allowed them to spend a lot of money on many things. And so that is what it was. It had nothing to do with social credit as such.
Hmm.
And as a matter of fact, toward the end of his career, Ernest Manning made a speech saying that social credit might have applied to the conditions in the Great Depression, but it didn't really apply to the conditions of the modern world. Well, as we know, Douglas, from the very beginning, he said that we would be forced because of technology and the way it interacts with the price system to produce more and more and more. He
Hmm.
was not writing in a period of deflation or a period of depression. He was warning about the internal pressures within the price system that would force society to produce more and more and more irrelevant and even destructive things just so they could produce financial incomes to buy what they'd produced in the past.
Mm. This
And
is
so that had obviously Ernest Manning was covering what he should have known, or he just didn't understand things very well.
Yeah, this to
Yeah.
me shows that this whole question of social credit doesn't come up as a funny money system, but rather something that you've got to put scholarship in. You've actually got to read it. And I must admit, Wallace, I've been in the periphery of the social credit movement since I was a young man.
Hmm.
And but the fact is that the more that I study it, and especially lately, the more that I study it, the more I realise how little I knew, and yet I'd
Yes.
taken so much for granted.
Yeah.
And so it's actually this scholarship that's is absolutely vital. It's necessary, and if you can't do it, then you'll never understand it. And that was the point that was going on in Alberta, was that the social credit electorate in Alberta was actually study groups. The whole electorate was actually involved in learning what this thing about social credit was about, what the monopoly of credit was about with central banks and things like that, and how to alleviate poverty amidst plenty. And that does not come easy. They had to put themselves back through university. And when you've got a monopoly of education, and only one, if you like, one point of view, one industrial point of view. And that industry, is, of course, is generally described as coming out of the London School of Economics. Only
Hmm.
one point of view. And so the entire nation, and in this case, nations' point of view, can't change. It won't change because they're actually caught up in an intellectual straitjacket. Whereas Alberta, in the 1930s, early 1930s, was undoing that through scholarship and effort. They were saving themselves. They weren't sure about it. They didn't have the intellect, the technical depth, but they were a social credit electorate. What was the major obstacle, of course, is the fact that the administration, right up to the federal level, the administration was anti-social credit. It was
Yeah.
opposed to it. And that was the area that we've got to recognise that if any community wishes to actually implement social credit, the first thing they've got to do is seize the administration. They've got to understand what's going on, but seize the administration and then ensure that policy is pursued. Policy, not the technicalities, policy, because you won't have the second rate expert telling the first rate expert anything. In fact, the
Hmm.
first rate expert will make sure that the second rate expert fails. Wallace.
Well, that's true because if we try to get into technical things ourselves as advocates, unless we happen to be at the center of the movement, we're going to make mistakes. And as Douglas said, you can be assured that the powers that be will be quick to place blame on such people for any mistakes that are
Mm-hmm,
made and any unfortunate consequences that follow.
mm-hmm,
So you have to bring it's the responsibility of elected representatives to hire competent people, and it is the responsibility of the electorate to tell the the elected representatives basically what policy they want.
mm-hmm,
We want dividends. We want falling prices. We want policies, but you can't go to them and say we want you to do it, and we're going to suggest that you do it this way and this way and this way and this way. You have qualified people who are quite capable of doing it
mm-hmm,
and who will be happy to take on the job if they're hired, but they have to be hired and they have to be willing to try objectively to do it. And if they don't, they should be fired until you get people who will do it.
mm-hmm,
That's responsibility. It's a chain of command. It's a chain of responsibility, and it has to be followed.
mm.
Otherwise, you've got total confusion, and nothing will happen.
That's right. Yeah.
But the
Everyone would be coming up with another as their understanding of something. My understanding says
yeah.
this, my understanding says that. And I must admit, listening to different religious points of view, I
Hmm.
find that they're all over the place,
Yes.
and they accommodate everything and anything. It's quite extraordinary.
Well, you see, people have to understand that Douglas was part of an intellectual milieu in the early part of the last century. There was all sorts of stuff going on, highly disciplined stuff, and economic research and that sort of thing. Douglas was involved in that. He appeared at government-sponsored hearings
Hmm.
with regard to credit and finance and so on.
Hmm.
The Macmillan Commission or committee, and the hearings that were held in Canada and New Zealand.
Hmm.
Uh, he testified in Tokyo at the World Engineering Congress.
Hmm.
Douglas was a disciplined, educated British individual. He was a competent and accomplished uh, engineer, and he was accustomed to thinking in a disciplined manner.
Hmm.
And that's what made him so dangerous to the existing financial system. And that's why the Association of British Bankers is reputed to have allocated about 5 million uh, British pounds sterling to discredit social credit, while the Rockefeller Foundation financed an enormous multi volume project, which ultimately appeared to be discredit social credit. And they actually hired a professional Marxist, self declared Marxist professor to write the key book attempting to discredit social credit. Now, it's interesting that the Rockefeller Foundation should be hiring Marxists in order to discredit social credit.
Mm. Mm.
But it does illustrate that the financial powers and the revolutionary powers have always been quite closely associated with finance supporting revolution, going back to the French Revolution,
Hmm.
because they both have the objective of centralizing power.
Hmm.
And you have to centralize wealth to do that.
Mm.
But the real apex is the credit power,
Hmm.
which which straddles the entire structure and really directs everything from a centralized point.
Mm.
People don't realize that.
Mm.
People
It
people
what
see,
it what it does for me, Wally, is it shows that this is not going to come lightly. It's not going to come easy, and we have to actually go and do our homework in order to understand it. I'm just going to call for closing comments, Wally, because we've gone past the half hour,
oh,
and I do want to continue on with this.
sure.
Even if possible, we can make further time during this week. That would be fantastic. So, closing comments, please, Wally Klinck.
I think, as someone said, we're dealing with a very, very critical issue. The issue is who owns the credit of society. Right now, the banking fraternity claims to own the credit that they create against the nation's wealth. We don't object to them performing an accountancy function in creating money for production, but we do object to them saying that they own that money and that they have the right to foreclose on anyone if they fail to pay the banks back for the loans that have been issued. The banks create no wealth, I mean, no physical wealth. Well, they create some services, but I mean, they're not in any way a significant producer of the real wealth of the community. They provide a critical service, but that's all. And they should be paid for what they do, but they should not be allowed to say, we own the earth. And when they issue a loan and say that they have to be repaid for the loan when they've issued against the community's real wealth, that means they have the right to foreclose on the community's real wealth.
Mm.
So we are challenging the claim of the banks to the ownership of the credit of society. That is a pretty profound situation.
No worries. That's an excellent summary. Thank you, Wallace Clink, for today. That's an excellent opening salvo in regard to the Alberta experiment under the banner of the history of social credit. And I look forward to us picking this subject up again in the near future. This is Arnie Luks at Freedom Forum. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. We'll see you soon enough.